You're with Cape Talk.
All right, it's 8:10. Welcome to it. It's the Wednesday panel. I'm joined in studio. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me. Rayburn Hendricks is the CEO of H1 Holdings, an independent power producer and investor.
That's correct.
Yeah, and Mark Tanton is the board member of the South African Wind Energy Association. Thank you very much for joining us. And Vuyo Nto is spokesperson for the South African Photovoltaic Industry Association, and for lay people like me, that's the solar guys. Thank you very much for joining me in studio. We all know where we stand at the moment. Luckily, we're at stage 2, but there's a bigger crisis here in the provision of electricity. I mentioned to the listeners earlier on that today is the 12th anniversary of the first apology Thabo Mbeki made for load shedding in 2007 at an ANC fundraiser. What are some of the opportunities that we may be able to get from independent power production to quell the shortcomings of production from the existing grid? I'm going to start with you, Ray, because you actually are one of our current providers.
Sure, okay. Good morning, Refilwe. I think there's a number of opportunities. With the other panel members, we actually had a discussion just beforehand, but in the extreme kind of short term, there is an opportunity for the current IPPs to raise their capacity in the very kind of short term, in terms of like raising, generating a bit more power than their like nameplate capacity. Mm-hmm. So that's something in the very short term that can be done. It's not a significant number in the overall scheme of things. We've seen almost estimates of anything probably around the 300 megawatts area, which is not a big number in the overall scheme of things, but that is a very short-term thing that can be done.
Yes.
There are some other slightly more medium-term like measures which perhaps Mark could like mention about bringing our production like a bit further forward.
Well, of course, and of course the Wind Energy Association actually called for greater inclusion onto the grid just this week. So I'd be curious to hear the readiness and what those opportunities are.
Yeah, thanks, Refilwe. So I think maybe it's important to start by looking at stage 2 means we've got 2,000 megawatts off the grid.
Okay.
So when we start talking about numbers, your listeners need to just put it into perspective. So
Thank you.
As Rayburn alludes to, there's no silver bullet at the moment, but so Rayburn starts by talking about raising what we call the maximum export capacity. So these plants have been designed and they've been slightly overspec'd. The contracts that we all have with Eskom says that we are capped with the amount of power we're allowed to export. So with the current existing projects, if that cap is lifted for a period, we'd be able to realize if it's 300, 500 megawatts, as Rayburn says, it doesn't deal with stage 4, but 500 megawatts is a big difference when you're looking at a stage 2. The second thing that we could do is that there are projects that were signed off in the recent round, which was round 4 of government's procurement, which are currently under construction. These projects, if they are given a commitment that if they connect to the grid early, they will be able to sell their power to Eskom, they will accelerate their program. There's already one project that has been asking Eskom for quite some time to accelerate, has been denied. They chose to unilaterally accelerate. They are meant to connect in September. They're connecting now in the next month. Okay. So they're going to provide the country with free power for 4 months. So it's those kind of things. It's not going to be a silver bullet, but all of those little interventions can make a significant difference to the current load shedding.
And we were having this discussion a little earlier. That's down to the government procurement, where you were highlighting the fact that solar comes in at an important space where we can take the power into our own hands as private consumers. What's the opportunity there for us to take a bit more control of the provision of power?
Yeah, again, bring it back to kind of simple terms that people can understand. Stage 2 is essentially 2,000 megawatts off the grid. Mm-hmm. We believe that the acceleration of the approval of small-scale embedded generation projects that are waiting to be approved and can be instituted within 12 months could provide that 2,000 megawatts. And the reason why they can be put into effect quite so quickly is because it doesn't involve a government procurement process. It's essentially projects where people either self-provide or private parties contract between each other, and that obviously reduces the pressure on Eskom from a provision perspective, reduces pressure on the grid. And in fact, if all those projects had been approved or had gone ahead, we wouldn't have stage 2, which is where we are at the moment. We put out a press release earlier in the week urging government to lift what we think is an arbitrary cap of 1 megawatt on embedded self-generation before requiring NERSA licensing.
Is that per household or?
No. Well,
1 megawatt
1 megawatt is essentially the size of a facility.
Okay.
And it can be kind of on a mall, for instance.
Yes.
I think you could find that the amount of generation that can be procured from rooftop on a mall is a bit more than 1 megawatt. And beyond 1 megawatt, you need a NERSA license, which is a convoluted process that involves months of regulatory hurdles. If you removed that regulatory hurdle, remove the arbitrary regulatory hurdle, you'd get up to 2,000 megawatts on the grid within the year.
Sure. All right. And the cost differential from coal to solar?
Well, I'd hate to compare people providing panels on their roofs to what Eskom can charge, but obviously it's better to have power than not, even though it's cheaper. And I suppose in the last round of large-scale utility procurements, we reached a point called grid parity, where essentially your procurement of renewables is at the same sort of pricing per megawatt hour as your next best non-renewable alternative. And we believe that in round 5, which is the next round of the renewable procurement process, we should see tariffs that are below what Eskom is charging users. And in fact, this would be a boon for Eskom in the sense that they'd actually now make profit on what they'd be procuring from IPPs, and that can be a start to starting to restore their financial solvency, I suppose.
Vuyo makes a very good point there, and your question on cost. It's important to know what Vuyo is talking about is a willing buyer, willing seller market, where the market will determine whether they're happy to pay or not. So this whole question of cost, we've got to grid parity, we've actually got below grid parity, and the reality is what's holding us back. So same on the wind side, we're saying liberalize the market and if a large mine wants to buy 100 megawatts from a wind facility or from a PV facility, let them do it. But right now there are significant hurdles for having that being realized.
Not only significant, but that NERSA license you were saying, the arbitrary limit, there's a clear political something there, right? So in terms of competitive control.
Well, it's everything from control to, for instance, municipalities make a lot of their money from selling electricity. And as soon as end users essentially defect from grid, there's a large chunk of municipal revenues that potentially falls away. But I'm sure there's a solution somewhere.
Just a quick question to your panelists. What other storage is there available other than battery storage? It's great generating power during the day, but what happens at night? Roger.
Thanks, Roger. Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Okay. Perhaps the form of storage that people don't really think about is actually hydro.
Okay.
So we've got a big pump storage scheme that Eskom owns, and essentially what they do is during the day they use the solar panels that are generating power from the IPPs to pump water up their pump storage system, and at night they let the water loose. So that's essentially kind of very efficient battery, I suppose you could call it that.
And is that something at a consumer level or maybe more at a facility level?
No. That's kind of a utility scale.
Okay, gotcha. All right.
Refilwe, but I guess the comment on storage and night is that's the beauty of wind and solar in our mix is that wind is blowing at night and the sun is shining during the day, but the wind is often both during the day and night. And what's important to note is that when from a wind facility or a solar facility you're putting power into the grid in essence acts as a storage, but allows Eskom time to do maintenance, to sort out problems that they have. So Vuyo is correct. We have pump storage. Batteries are starting to become a lot cheaper, But I don't think we should get focused on storage because we can produce power at night and during the day.
Quite right. So let's talk a little bit about that energy mix. The Integrated Resource Plan came out a couple of months ago. It introduced some increased space for wind, an increase from 13 to 18% in terms of the long-term 2030 expectation of the mix being made up of wind, 7% from solar, hydro 8%, and nuclear 4.5%, the rest from gas and steel. Diesel. Just talk to me around, are those the optimal levels from the research that you have done, that government has come to, or is this also around managing what Eskom can create?
I'll just, like the word optimal has a very particular use.
Yes.
That energy plan is not the least cost plan. So so if one means by it's optimal the least cost. Mm-hmm. It's not the least cost because there have been constraints which the Department of Energy imposed on that plan for a variety of reasons. Just for listeners, the least cost at the moment on a levelized cost basis, it's wind is the cheapest at the moment if you had to build a new wind plant, then would be solar, and then would be the fossil-based fuels. So if one was only focused on the cost per kilowatt hour, you'd bias yourself first towards wind and solar, as that plan does. Mm-hmm. But when, I guess, from the Department of Energy, they have other concerns. One is security, energy security.
Right.
South Africa has a lot of coal.
Right.
So they probably want to bias towards those technologies. We also have an established industrial base in the fossil-based fuels, so there would be some political considerations around jobs and effect on communities and so forth. And then the last thing would be that until we've got what Mark mentioned, a very diversified wind and solar base, the Department of Energy would be concerned about the base load, how reliable can the diversification of all these producers be. So I think it's not the lowest cost.
Yes.
But my personal view on the long-term energy plan, it's a very good start to the journey.
Great.
And I think, and what the department has said is that this will be re-evaluated as and when there are bidding rounds and more information comes through about the relative costs of the different technologies. So I think what we have, this is the first time in 10 years we've got a long-term plan.
For sure.
And it might not be perfect according to what your views are, but it's a very good beginning.
So least cost is a great consideration. Another consideration for optimal is clean. And the plan does speak to getting more clean energy, but it speaks to the government itself intervening in, I suppose, developing technologies for this. Why not leave it to people who are currently in the mix like yourselves?
Yeah, I mean, that depends on, are you looking at clean coal or are you looking at a clean energy mix?
What is clean coal? Is that possible?
Well, to me, that's a contradiction.
Right.
But I'm a wind guy, so I'm biased.
So I asked this because when you talk about the least cost option, you go wind, solar, fossil. There was a time when coal made sense from a strategic perspective as a country, when it was the cheapest way for us to produce electricity. It no longer is. And the world is moving in a direction not only from the perspective of clean energy, but now we know that this doesn't really, I'm sure, tie in with the Paris Accord. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think you might just find that reality sort of gets in the way of those aspirations. The truth is, finding new funding for coal projects is nigh on impossible at the moment. So if Eskom or any IPP is seeking funding for new coal projects, it's going to be quite a challenge.
Exactly. And so then again, I see you as being the alternatives. I mean, how soon on the review of this IRP, for example, that Ray mentions, do we, at the next round of procurement, find ourselves actually ratcheting up the allocations to each of your sources, particularly because experience and over time, I think it's going to get cheaper, especially with scale. Is that something that might come a little sooner than 10 years hence?
Well, that's the beauty of these technologies, of wind and solar in particular, that you can, once you've decided that you want the projects, you can start construction, and within 18, 24, 36 months you have the plant online, which allows for a lot of flexibility in your planning. So where you haven't planned properly, like as South Africa has unfortunately not done, wind and solar are primed to fill that gap. So as South Africa learns that they can bring on more wind and solar, the projects are there and are ready to come online. They don't take a 10-year lead time.
Right.
If you look at Medupi and Kusile, that's a 10-year plus lead time.
Yes.
So wind and solar are primed to come on very quickly, be adaptive, and can fill the gaps. So from the wind perspective, we're very happy with the current IRP. We know that number is going to go up, because as wind gets cheaper, same for solar, the government is going to want more of what we're selling.
Fantastic. That gives greater long-term profitability prospects for Eskom. I've got a question here from one of our listeners.
If Eskom are so against the renewable energy because of their loss of income in that instance, why don't they become involved in renewable energy themselves? Thank you.
Anyone want to have a thought?
Well, I mean, you could talk about...
Is it a point of expertise and focus?
No, so I think we have to be fair to Eskom. Eskom is not against renewable energy. Eskom has this coal base and has lots of assets that are coal. They can't throw that away overnight, even though some of them are crumbling overnight. So you have to be fair to Eskom. They're not necessarily anti-renewables. The second point is that government made a decision that focused on renewables, we would have independent power producers. So we'd move from state-owned to private sector, and they've used the renewable industry as that test case. So there are some inside Eskom who said they would like to be more focused on renewables. As an industry, we say, you've opened that up to private sector, let's leave that in the hands of private sector. So Eskom is not necessarily stopping this. There's policy that guides what Eskom can and can't do.
Fair enough.
And it's that policy we need to change.
And there's implementation capacity as well. So if you're trying to implement Medupi and Kusile, all your technical guys should probably focus on that, and the private sector can introduce the renewables.
I feel a lot lighter. I feel a lot more positive about the outlook. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for giving us this perspective. This is on our independent power production in the integrated resource mix. Rayburn Hendricks, again, is CEO at H1 Holdings. Mark Tanton, board member of the South African Wind Energy Association, and Vuyo Ndoye, spokesperson for the South African Photovoltaic Industry Association. Thanks, gents, so much for your insights, expertise, and optimism.